Today, will the coronavirus hit growth? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to the latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. An outbreak of pneumonia-like illness that started in the Chinese city of Wuhan has put health authorities on high alert around the world. It's led cities to be cordoned off, caused airlines to cancel flights to and from China, and has disrupted global supply chains. The new coronavirus, named 2019 nCoV, is thought to have originated in the food market of the central China metropolis and has since infected more than 7,500 people and counting. Deaths and cases are likely to rise until the outbreak is contained, and now we have confirmed cases of close to 8,000, with deaths worldwide around 170, and again, counting. Now, China first reported the outbreak on December the 30th, and most of the deaths so far have been in Hubei province, where Wuhan is the capital. Chinese authorities have restricted some travel to try and stop the illnesses since the 23rd of January, and Chinese financial markets will remain closed until Monday the 3rd of February. This is because authorities extended the Lunar New Year holiday break by 3 days. While Ebola kills half the people who get it, and SARS killed 10%, the new virus fatality rate appears to be only about 2%. But experts are worried that the virus's mild symptoms will cause those who carry it to unsuspectingly transmit it too far and fast. A 10-year-old boy was diagnosed with the virus despite showing no symptoms, and in Wuhan, public transport and ride-hailing services have been suspended, trains and flights from the city have been stopped, and people have been told to leave only for essential reasons. Similar travel restrictions were announced in at least 11 other Chinese cities, impacting more than 40 million people. And the World Health Organization is holding a meeting of its emergency committee on Thursday to consider issuing a global alarm as China announced more deaths from the spread of the virus. So, will it be declared a global health emergency? Well, that will depend on how widespread the virus is and its potential impact, plus concerns that combined action internationally will be required to try to reduce the spread. Of course, governments have already tightened international travel and border crossings with China as they ramped up efforts to stop the spread of the disease. Airlines across the world suspended more flights to the country as the US, the UK, Japan and other countries moved to evacuate citizens from the outbreak's epicenter. And here in Australia, more than 40 people are being monitored in Queensland following a case confirmed on the Gold Coast when the infected individual flew from Melbourne at the end of January. The 44-year-old Chinese man is in a stable condition in the Gold Coast hospital, but 4 others from his tour group, among them children, are being tested for the lethal virus, and authorities are trying to contact almost 200 other people who shared the sick man's Tiger Airways flight from Melbourne to the Gold Coast on January the 27th. But what are the potential longer-term implications? Well, according to Moody's, the primary impact is on human health. However, the risk of contagion is affecting economic activity and financial markets. In fact, Fed Chair Jerome Powell discussed this as part of his press conference today when he announced no change to the cash rate.
I would say now there are grounds for what I would call cautious optimism about the outlook now for the global economy. Many analysts are predicting a pickup in growth this year, although still to relatively modest growth rates. And people are pointing to, we would point to supportive financial conditions, the easing of trade tensions, the lower odds of a hard Brexit. The high-tech manufacturing industry does appear to be rebounding well in Asia, including in China. The latest indicators, manufacturing PMIs, for example, suggest that manufacturing may have bottomed out, that they're still below 50 in many jurisdictions, but they have moved up off of their lows. I would just say none of this is assured. As I mentioned, we saw the fourth quarter of last year came in quite weak, weaker than expected. We are not at all assured of a global rebound, but there are signs and reasons to expect it. And then comes the coronavirus, which again, it's too early to say what the effects will be. Of course, we're, as I mentioned, monitoring it carefully. There will clearly be implications, at least in the near term, for Chinese output, and I would guess for some of their close-in neighbors, and we'll just have to see what the effect is globally.
So, not really so much detail there. But can we go further than this? Well, the most immediate and most significant impact is going to be in China itself, but it will reverberate globally, given the importance of China in global growth, as well as in global company revenue. By sector, the coronavirus will likely have the largest negative impact on goods and services sector within and outside of China that rely on Chinese consumers and intermediary products. So at one end of the spectrum, some economists are arguing that whilst the composition of Chinese GDP might change, the overall growth rate won't. But others are forecasting drops of 1% or 2%, or I've seen even figures of 5%. But I think it's probably too soon to really make any sort of forecast. So it's clear that the outbreak will have a temporary impact on China's economy. And it seems to me that the GDP growth is probably still going to be around 5.8% in 2020, but the composition of growth will likely shift because of a dampening of consumption in the first quarter, potentially offset by stimulus measures. Nonetheless, there is still a high level of uncertainty around the length and intensity of the outbreak. And so it'll be necessary to review forecasts as conditions evolve. As a guide, following the outbreak of severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, in 2003, growth and financial markets in China weakened significantly, but for only a short period. An offsetting rebound limited the overall negative effect on annual growth. But the SARS episode is not a perfect comparison, since the composition of the Chinese economy has changed appreciably since 2003. Over the past 16 years, the contribution of consumption to China's economic growth has risen significantly. Therefore, the impact of the coronavirus through the consumption channel may well be higher now. If there is indeed a sharp slowdown in consumption, then we would expect macroeconomic policies to be eased in response. And this could lead to a shift in the drivers of growth in 2020. The virus will likely have an effect on the revenue of China's discretionary travel, transportation, lodging, restaurants, retail and services sector. However, the impact on offline retail sales could be smaller compared with the weakness following the SARS outbreak because of the rapid shift to online sales in China over the past decade. Non-discretionary consumer demand related to the healthcare sector and medical equipment will likely surge. Chinese authorities have been proactive in taking quarantine measures to contain the infection, including closing public transportation in some cities and conducting screening in major transportation centres. These measures help contain the spread of infection and promote early treatment, although they add costs and constrain economic activity. There are a number of challenges relating to containing the virus, including that it can be contagious during the incubation period, and many of those infected or potentially infected travelled ahead of the Lunar New Year. The next few weeks, therefore, will be vital for determining the extent of infection and the effectiveness of the quarantine measures. Loss of productivity will likely weigh on domestic supply as a result of sickness, furloughs, and potential delays in manufacturing production, given the government's decision to extend the Lunar New Year holiday. This situation will likely also reduce private investment, but this effect will be secondary to the effect on consumer spending and will also depend on the macroeconomic policy response. Hubei province will bear the brunt of economic impact. The outbreak began in Wuhan, the capital of Hubei province, and the key transportation and industrial hub in central China. The economic effects on the local area will be significant. Hubei province had expected to record a regional economic growth rate of up to 7.8% in 2020. According to the local authorities, 200 basis points higher than forecasts for the total economy. As China's ninth most populous and seventh highest province by GDP, a slowdown in economic activity will pose significant repercussions for the country as a whole. Hubei's role in linking China's eastern coastal area with the central and western regions will extend the ripple effect on neighbouring cities and provinces with a higher reliance on service sectors and with higher population densities. China's size and interconnectedness amplifies global impact. The fear of contagion risk is already evident in global financial markets. In addition, the negative spillover will also affect countries, sectors and companies that either derive revenue from or produce in China. China has an even higher share in world growth and is even more closely connected with the rest of the world than during the SARS episode. If the outbreak spreads significantly outside China, the burden on healthcare sectors in other affected countries will potentially increase. The revenue of companies and sectors that rely on Chinese demand will be affected as that demand dampens. The outbreak will also potentially have a disruptive effect on global supply chains. Global companies operating in the affected areas may face output losses as a result of the evacuation of workers. And companies operating outside China that have a strong dependence on the upstream output produced from the affected area will also be under pressure because of possible supply chain disruptions resulting from temporary production delays. Other Asian-Pacific economies are vulnerable to a decline in tourism from China, and the outbreak will take a toll on tourism sectors elsewhere in the region and places outside the region that receive tourists from China. The initial outbreak occurred a few weeks before the Lunar New Year, which has increasingly become a popular time to travel. China has imposed travel bans on outbound group tours to contain the spread of the virus. The fear of contagion could dampen consumer demand and affect tourism, travel, trade and services in Hong Kong, Macau, Thailand, Japan, Vietnam, Singapore, and of course, Australia, all of which have been the top destinations of Chinese tourists in recent years. China's National Immigration Administration recorded outbound travel growth about 12% year on year to 6.3 million trips during the 2019 Lunar New Year. Following the SARS outbreak, tourism fell sharply in most of these economies, particularly in Singapore and Hong Kong, which were also subject to a relatively high number of infections. So it's likely that the risk of potential negative spillovers to domestic tourism in neighbouring countries will be higher than during SARS because Chinese nationals now make up the largest share of visitors to other Asia-Pacific economies. The timing is particularly bad for Japan as it seeks to rebound from the dip in consumption and presumably real GDP growth in the last quarter of 2019 following a sales tax hike. And in Australia, we're still dealing with the fallout from the bushfires. So tourism was already under pressure, as we discussed in our recent post. And now this adds a whole another layer of complexity to the local economy here. And it's worth reflecting that if production slows, particularly around iron ore, then demand for our exports could decline, and we could see the price of iron ore also falling. So as well as the direct consumer impact of smaller numbers of visitors coming from China to Australia, it's also likely that our terms of trade could well be adversely affected. So whilst it's still too soon to try and really come to an estimation of the true impact, because the infection rate is still increasing, it's clear to me that the headwinds with regard to our local economy, as well as global growth, are going to be significantly stronger than we might have expected, thanks to the rise of the virus. we'll be updating our economic models over the next few weeks as more information comes to hand. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.